Welcome to What's Going On, the weekly podcast and videocast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. Hi, this is Pastor Katie from First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota, and I'm glad you could join me for this episode. Today, I have a very special guest with me. Last week, I happened to mention her and her ordination in the podcast, and that led to a big conversation and realization that she's never been on the podcast, nor did she even know about it. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to my dear, dear friend, Reverend Emily Munger. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel very special.
I don't think I've ever referred to you with your full title before, so that was kind of fun.
Yeah, so the kids that I just started teaching Sunday school at the Highmore Lutheran Church last night, and they all know me by Emily. So I go by many names because I am not the pastor of that particular congregation. So it is like this strange flow of context.
Yes.
What called?
Yeah, so last week I talked in the podcast about clergy stoles because so many of you, I've started wearing my clergy stoles for communion Sundays. And so I shared the story of Emily's ordination that I attended when I was commissioned but not ordained. And so I robed as clergy because I was clergy, but I wasn't ordained clergy. And so and then it just so happened that last week after I told that story, it came up on Facebook that it was the 10-year anniversary of that date. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just talked about this. So
It's hard to believe.
10 years. 10
Yeah.
years. So I texted her and she's like, I don't know how you knew that. That's weird.
I was like, what?
Well, I was like, I don't even know if I messaged you for your birthday, but for your ordination anniversary, I got it.
Well, I think that you were the only one who texted me for my 10-year anniversary of ordination, so I appreciated it.
So Emily and I have been friends. We met each other, I think, when we were 5 years old, way back in kindergarten at Arlington Elementary School. So we have known each other a long time. I was like, gonna do the math, and I don't want to do the math because it makes me sad. And thought it would be interesting to kind of share our journeys because the odds of two people from such a small town in the same class going into ministry in the ways that we did is pretty unusual. And that both of us ended up in ministry in churches that were not what we grew up in.
Right. Like, yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
So can I share the story about into college?
Yes.
The case. So like all through Arlington, right? We're together. And then when we split after high school and went to different colleges, there we had, maybe very occasional communication, but not much. It was also pre-social media. World of pre-social media.
Facebook became a thing while we were in college.
While we were like, sophomores or juniors or something.
Yeah.
So I make this really bold decision to go study abroad at Oxford through the CCCC, Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, maybe? CCCU. There we go. Okay. And I don't know why we happened to be like messaging or something, right?
I think it was Neely that figured it out. So we have a third
friend was it?
In this.
Okay.
The three of us throughout high school were close. Neely is the non-clergy one of us.
Bless her.
Bless her. I think it was Neely that figured it out.
Okay. So
to us independently.
I was like, I'm doing this. And you're like, I'm doing this too. Or somehow and I was like, well, that's just bizarre, right? And then I was like, but what like program are you going through? And then you're like, well, what was it called? SCIO.
Yes. Semester.
SCIO something in Oxford. You're so smart.
We went to Oxford, Emily. We are
so smart. And then I think it was at that point where we were both like, are you kidding me? We're doing this together. We decided then that we would do the same house. I think we had already kind of made the decision independently, but
Right.
confirmed we were going to like live in the same house together. So we went from, if I'm doing my math, 2.5 years of basically not really too much engagement.
Yeah, like Merry Christmas. How are
Right.
things going? Maybe see you at a volleyball game or something.
To a very intense semester living together in Oxford University. And I'm still floored like 20 years later that that
Right.
happened. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So that's
I
my
think,
one of my favorite parts of our story.
yeah, just that the way that we kind of kept coming together, and
Hmm.
like we definitely have our own journeys of things, but how like life just kept uh mirroring each other in
Right,
some.
because then you were in Millbank
Yeah.
while I was out, I believe, doing my Master of Divinity around those same time.
So yeah, because right out of college, I went to Massachusetts for 2 years.
Yep. And I was
And
on
then,
the rest.
right, you were doing AmeriCorps.
AmeriCorps. Yep.
And then when I came back to South Dakota, I went to Millbank and was doing youth ministry. And then you went to the East Coast.
That's when I went to the East Coast. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you had this like continual stirring
Mhm.
and all the things are happening and maybe that was it an MA that you got the first time or
Yeah.
Master of Theology? Um, just wasn't quite on the mark.
Right.
And so you just were an overachiever who went back to seminary. And
That's
then
a
that's
really
when
nice way to put it.
I started or I moved back to South Dakota.
I think I was in Chicago.
I visited you in Chicago
I
once. I
think
remember.
you were when you were coming back through, maybe
Yeah. Because
you
I
guys
can't remember
stopped in
if I was
Chicago.
with AJ or not, but
Well, at one time you and Neely.
yeah, it was with Neely. This is fascinating. I like all of our like threads. They're all like woven together, but I don't have like a super clear picture of the tapestry because it all like happened like
Right. Because we were
synchronicity.
constantly sort of exchanging. Like one of us would be in seminary and then the other one, and then the other one. Because again, I went back because I'm
And I will say, in the midst of all of it, I do feel like Neely serves a crucial point of connection in particular, because especially as like a little bit like idealists, philosopher, pastor types, we can kind of get like up in our head about things and forget, or like just busy.
yeah, you just
That's
kind of
the
get
thing too.
absorbed in what you're
Yeah,
doing and
like
where
in your
you
everyday
are.
life. And then
Yeah.
Neely's like, hey guys, let's hang out.
Neely's like an accountant type and
Yeah, yeah.
doesn't get absorbed in her work in the same way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very true. I like that. I like that. We should
Uh,
have Neely on. Where's
I
Neely in our
know. All right. If you guys are liking this episode and you want to hear more about and
comment? Neely.
yeah, yeah,
Neely.
maybe I'll send it to her as a little nudge.
That'd be
Um uh so so but somehow it all worked out because when I was only in Chicago 2 years. And when I came back from Chicago is when I got commissioned and started working in a church. But it was that same time because I had just started in July and your
good.
ordination was in September.
Was in September. Yep.
So we
And so
really,
I
yeah,
had only started, so I had done pulpit supply for a year for that church, but only started full-time ministry that July. Like literally, I think within like days of each other.
right. Which
Wasn't it?
again,
That's crazy.
how weird
That's
is that?
crazy.
And so we were
That's
kind
crazy.
of embarking on this together. Emily in this tiny church in Columbia. There's someone
Mhm.
from our church who actually is from Columbia, which is just crazy.
That
But
is, that is.
and then I was in Mitchell at the time. I was an associate, she was a solo pass. So like we're starting at the same time, but again having these kind of wildly different
Hmm.
experiences.
Hmm.
And then
You know, and both I think growing into, like you had said earlier, a denomination that was not from our
mhm,
upbringing, but bringing the pieces from our like our faith heritage to bear on our new growth and understanding of like not just our theology, but I think church systems in
yeah,
general. Like because that's a distinction, right? Like I love to hear about like the Methodist world because that is not my world. And it's it keeps a certain like balance, like to
Mhm.
the faith ecosystem, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it can be helpful to have kind of a broadening perspective, and how different systems run and do things and the ways in which they work and the ways in which they definitely don't work, which I think every
I mean,
system.
that's never the case in the church.
No, everything always works the first time, on time. But so Emily is in the UCC church. We've been blessed. We work a lot with the UCC church here in Yankton. And so they've been a great partner in ministry, in mission with us. We do VBS together. We're doing Trunk or
Hmm,
Treat coming up together. We do a Loads of Love laundry mission together, along with Trinity
that's
Lutheran,
awesome.
the LCA church in town. So we've been really blessed by our partnership and ministry in that way with that church. And so, um, yeah, it gives me a lot of cred when I say, oh, I know Emily Munger. Oh, you know Emily.
So related, Katie, I think that one of the cool pieces that I have discovered as, I guess now 10 years of local church ministry in South Dakota, that one of the deep values in our, like, not necessarily rural context, but in general, sort of like a lower population base, um, is ecumenical ministry,
Mhm,
the shared purpose behind it, but also that kind of like gritty, hey, at the end of the day, we get that we're all just humans who love God.
mhm,
And that to me is so powerful and hopeful, especially like when we have enough um dissension and disunity going on. It's like there can be not only the real value from the church coming together religiously and theologically, but also even like across on political spectrums, and
mhm.
this idea that at the end of the day, we love our children together, like for
Yeah,
Vacation Bible School. At the end of the day, we all just acknowledge we need good news in our life,
yep.
and it may manifest differently, but we have the same God. So I just think that's a huge place of growth for me as a pastor in South Dakota, is acknowledging the power of that.
And I think some of like my background definitely lends to that as well, because I've in my younger years floated.
Yes.
I grew up in the Lutheran church, but then, hung out with Methodists, hung out with Baptists, hung out with, all kinds of different people because I didn't know what tradition suited me best at the time. And
Hmm.
finally landed with the Methodists. But but that gave me a lot of opportunity to, I think, see what you had just said, that at the end of the day, so many people are just doing their best to love God, and depending on the tradition you grew up in and what you've learned or taught or what you're comfortable with, kind of dictates so often what church you're a part of, because
Hmm.
um, I don't think everyone's like me that starts to ask the deep theological questions when they're in confirmation and have their pastor kind of like, nobody asked this, Katie. But why? But why? That was me as a kid.
See, this is what I
Actually,
like to do now. I identify these young women or men, and I say, have you ever thought about seminary?
I will say that when I was in high school and sort of going through my big discernment time, right around confirmation, I really had a profound experience and wanted to like dig into faith around in my freshman into sophomore year of high school. And one of the people that I pestered the most with questions was Emily, because in our class, you were one that was known to have really strong faith. And I remember,
Slash equally eccentric in our
but I remember like being in the
proclivities as
lunchroom,
teenagers.
Emily, if this, then why? And you're like, okay, let's talk about it.
So I only have like vague recollections of that, but also that's like something that again I appreciate other people like bringing to memory, because um for me I don't at all remember being annoyed by that, but like and I not at all, but
That
I
was
think
probably my own, like, she's probably annoyed with me.
yeah. I thought that my faith background did do a good job of making um talking about faith in everyday language really accessible. It was still a narrower point of view, but there was like a truth and a reality to it that I had experienced already, like personally, that I'm sure I just enjoyed having those conversations, you know. But I'm sure I was also just still figuring things out too, you know.
Yeah. Well, and I would say in high school, and there was a weird thing that happened sort of sophomore year where there was kind of like FCA became a really big thing for a while, and there were a lot of people sort of talking about faith and going to church in the high school that
Mm-hmm.
and that I would say wasn't always the case. I'm
Hmm.
not sure kind of what led to that, but I
Well, and in the Methodist world, we hung out at the Methodist Retreat Center,
yeah.
probably because you had worked there and you had keys or
No,
something. I don't know how
no,
we got it
that
there.
was prior to me working there because I worked there starting after high school. The day, remember, I stayed at your house graduation night and started work the next day out at camp. Because Emily, the house she grew up in was like 4 miles from camp.
Right next to it. Yeah. So who
Because
was
of
it that let us into the rec room?
it was the Myers, Bryce and Trent Meyer, because their mom worked out there.
Oh, that's
But yeah,
right.
we used to hang out at Lake Ponce at camp in high school just as like a hangout spot, basically for all the Christian kids who weren't going to go party and drink in a field.
That's true. It's
I
true.
do. We go to when we go to family camp there every summer. I go down into that game room and I'm just like, oh man, all the
That's
memories.
crazy. It has been a long time. Although I will say that summer I worked there after college with you. That's another part of our story. So I still feel indebted to this date for all the carpentry skills. I mean, they were like rudimentary, but I had never done a lot of that stuff. And so, um, who, oh, I was talking with Beata, last week, and I was like, do you know that I helped build one of these cabins here? The very first one. I said, there was only, I said there was only females on staff, and so we were officially finally given the opportunity to try to learn our carpentry skills. And I did like
Yeah,
nail gun for
yeah.
siding.
I learned
Um,
mudding
yep. And
for
then
drywall.
um sanding.
Oh yeah.
Yep. I actually had to do some of that this week in my own kitchen. So thank you, Hubbard, right? Is it
Yeah.
I think it
Hubbard,
was the
yeah, that was the
Hubbard
first one.
I didn't remember that. Beata told me.
That's all
That's
right.
how
That's all right.
but I was like, I recognize that name. So
Yeah.
yeah, there has been so we were lifeguards together that summer,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Only time I was a lifeguard, the only time I really felt like I was doing something was day one when this small, tiny little boy jumped into the water and froze and he like went into shock. And then his mom jumped out of the boat to help him. And then she froze and went into shock. And I was like, is this what this job is going to be like?
The first day. I
And
have no memory of
then
that.
nothing for the rest of the time. But and I did like they weren't wearing life jackets, but they were like
Yeah.
stunned or shocked or
I was
whatever.
gonna say in my 5 years working there, we only did one rescue, and it was actually a pastor's kid. Actually,
Hmm.
the pastor's kid who I worked for in Millbank, like I worked for that pastor, and so that kid, I ended up being his youth pastor,
Oh,
and
like
I
after the
was like, I
fact, too.
remember you because you're the only
Oh
rescue
my goodness.
because he was on an inner tube and he was floating out and we said you need to come back in and he jumped off the inner tube and he wasn't wearing a life jacket. It was prior to when we required them and he's like, I can't swim. It's like, why'd you jump off? So
Oh my
it was fun.
goodness.
But
Yeah.
I forgot. Kind of forgot that you worked out there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Six
So
dollars and 25 cents an hour, I think it was.
yeah, that's all you need.
Still about what we get paid, I mean, for ministry right now. Ah,
And so then so you worked up in Columbia, up by Aberdeen. For how long were you up there?
about 3 years. So it was
Years.
fairly short. Um, had both my babies during that time. And was traveling a distance. And at the time, the church did not have internet or no cell coverage up in Columbia. So I couldn't work from the church. So it was a very unique first call, I think, for that purpose. Like I lived about 45 minutes away. And so I had to work from home, also had my babies, and travel anytime I wanted to do anything like a pastoral care visit or something, I had to like make a day of it. So it was fascinating. There was also lots of unique factors in that congregation that financially that made it like a real treasure of growth and learning for me. And then my husband started working for his family's ranch, which is actually where we live right now. And it does feel like full circle, just a decade later, that we're now actually finally living at the ranch that he started
Yeah.
working for 11 years ago, I would say.
And then you moved from Columbia to Pierre and served
Yep,
in Pierre for,
6 years.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have yet to have an appointment 6 years, although I'm in my 5th year now at Yankton.
I was gonna say you're getting close there in
Yeah, this is
Yankton.
this is officially my longest appointment. So one of the differences you hear in our language is Emily's going to talk about calling, or like this is my
Hmm.
call, because she's in a call system where the churches call the pastors. And I talk about appointments because I'm in an appointed system where the bishop and the cabinet appoint pastors to churches. It's just one of the ways that um, even though we do the same kind of job, we have different
Hmm.
language for what we're talking about. So I just want to point that out, that if you heard her use that language of first call, uh,
Hmm.
in my system, our system, it's appointment.
Well, and it's also true that because when I speak about like my 3-year first call and 6-year second call, that to me in the UCC, those are pretty short, like
Right,
seasons.
right.
But in the Methodist, it's actually pretty normalized for that sort of thing
Yeah,
to
I
be.
would say we're getting longer in our appointments. Maybe that's me just hoping that's the case. No, I think we are for the most part, especially when you get into more complicated systems. So the last couple of pastors for Yankton have been both over
Mm,
years. And so,
mhm,
um, you know, here's hoping that I get to be one of those two. Um, but yeah, historically Methodist, it would be much shorter. They would
mhm,
have been moving every couple of years, um,
mhm.
100 years ago, but we've
Yeah.
shifted that a bit now. And some of it has to do with it's so complicated to try to move pastors and families, because spouses now work and need income as well, and you're uprooting families. Um, and there's a lot more consideration for that than I think there used to be.
Mhm.
Because really early on, circuit riders weren't doing that work with kids in tow. We're now.
Right. And I
So
also think having more female clergy, when the tide shifts there, there's this recognition all of a sudden that the spouse might actually need employment, like outside the home.
yeah,
Ooh.
yeah,
Yeah. Or
not a 2-for-1 deal anymore.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Which
yeah.
is, I mean, I don't think we talk about that very much, but that is a huge part of the shift in church culture.
Hmm.
And um, I think sometimes, especially as women, we feel like in order to name it, we might feel like um we're shortchanging the church by saying somehow you only get one pastor instead of two. But I think the truth is that there was just a lot of restriction um on the part of the spouse of the pastor in prior decades.
That
This is
honestly,
more of a
that's probably
liberation.
a guarantee of like that was a place where they would be able to do something, because they're coming in with the pastor, and those things would have been open because most of the clergy spouses would have been filling similar roles. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's very different now, and it's interesting. And and you've been in this too, and I talk a lot with other clergy women about, how do you handle uh how, in your case, how did you handle like your spouse's role within the church? And so,
Mhm.
one of the things I've learned in in marriage is very much that Jason is entitled to his own relationship to the church.
Mhm.
People will
Mhm.
try to be like, well, maybe Jason could do that. I'm like, if you want Jason to do something, you have to ask him, because I don't volunteer him for things. I don't expect things of him. Anything that he does for the church, apart from show up with the kids, because I do expect that actually,
Mhm.
needs to be his own choice.
Mhm. Oh yeah, I'm very, very much in the same boat. There's one distinction, um, in our relationship. I actually feel what you just expressed, but then like year one, maybe year two, they ask AJ to be a deacon, and he says yes. And my honest response at first was like, "Oh crap! Now who's gonna watch the kids when we have deacon meetings?" And he goes, I'm doing it for you." And I was like, "Why would you do it for me?" It was like this interesting, like,
Yeah.
microcosm of like church world, pastor husband,
Yeah.
like, dichotomy of what the expectation was on the other, right? Like my expectation was like I would have childcare during deacon meetings. And his expectation is that he would support the church that his wife
Right.
serves, you know?
I so I think there are some like boundaries around what Jason can serve on in the church because he's married to me. Like he can't serve on SPR, which is our like
Yep.
HR committee. He can't serve on certain things. And I wouldn't want him to, because again, and I think it would create such a weird dynamic of
Right.
people would one either assume that he's going to be the leader because I'm a leader, and that might not be his comfort.
Mhm.
Or they would lean on him to try to get me to do or
Mhm. Oh
something,
yeah, like get
which would put him in
triangulated
such a
really
weird
easily.
position.
Yeah.
Um, Although I will say that I'm very excited. Jason is taking our Sunday morning disciple Bible study, which is a really big commitment. And when he told me he was wanting to do that, I had the same thought of like, right now I got to figure out childcare because we got 3 kids and I have to be here
Yay.
too. But
I'm
I
like,
will do it
wonderful.
because I'm so excited that you
Yes,
want to do this.
yes. Yep.
Um, and so, but I did have that same thought of like,
Hmm.
watch the kids on Sundays.
Hmm.
But we got it worked out, and it makes me. The other thing that he has found that he does that I think is such a perfect fit for him is he makes our communion bread. Jason is a like,
That is great.
mhm. Yeah, and so that one I really do like, and I feel like it's such a perfect thing for him to do.
And
So
it's so tangible. And I think so
right,
much like of people's participation in a life of faith is especially, I mean, some people love to live in their heads, but most of us love to like use our bodies and like do. And so that is like a cool way for him to express that um
yeah,
in your church.
and also he's gotten quite a reputation for being a good cook. Um, I
Right.
think sometimes to the like exclusion that like, hey, I can cook too.
Yeah. Oh, I hear that because my husband, I do 95% of the cooking in our house, but then whenever we have guests, AJ cooks, and then everybody leaves and says, "Oh, you're so lucky. You have a husband who loves to cook." And I just go, "Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm."
Or they think that Jason is like a solo parent because every time they see him, he is
He's
parenting because
always,
they see
yep,
him when I'm working.
yep,
And
yep.
and they forget that like, when I do actually quite a bit of this. And I'm very capable.
Mhm.
But I am grateful for him doing it. But it's
Right,
just because
right.
they see,
Those don't have to be, yeah, a dichotomy. They just
yeah,
can coexist.
oh,
You
he's
know,
such a good dad. He
that's the
is a
same. When
great
I
dad.
first started in peer, people said, like, I would be like in 100% action as a pastor, right? At like a funeral or whatever. And they'd be like, "Where are your children?" And I'd be like, "They're at daycare."
Yeah.
Are there other working moms bringing their kids to work every day? Is that a thing? Is that a
Yeah.
thing? So there's this very strange, um, people feel personal, like a personal sense of connection with a pastor, and therefore, and the family,
Mhm.
the whole family unit, right? And
Yeah.
so I got asked more times than I can count where my kids were when I was in pastor action. And it was this very weird, like, confluence of, okay, that's kind of sweet that you want to see my kids, but are you expecting that I would somehow be watching my own children while I'm also working?
Yeah.
It was a difficult
Right.
thing for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah. I'm struggling. I mean, that's what I'm doing this week with Abigail, because she doesn't have daycare. And so I've been not working in the office this week. And even just to do the bare minimum of things that I needed to go
Mhm.
with has been so challenging. She's
Mhm.
awesome, but she's also two.
Yep.
If I had to do, I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
Well, you
And
can't. I mean, so
oh,
I think that's what I think the realization that um that hit people during COVID when we were asked to teach our kids and work full time and do our childcare for all the little ones. And it was just like ridiculous. I think it was out of the context of ministry in other people's contexts that finally, for me, felt like a reprieve. Like I wasn't the only one trying to explain why
mhm.
that's impossible.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
like these other people that were saying, it's just it's not that you're not doing it well, that it's impossible to do.
Mhm.
And then I was like, oh, yes, it is.
Yeah. The only reason I can even record this right now is because Abigail's napping. And if she's
Yep.
not napping, she's being quiet in her room. But uh, she was still asleep when I left. Um, so Emily, you were in here for 6 years. And so share a little bit because you are now the youngest retired person I know.
Retired at 38. So, oh my gosh. Okay, I'm in it. Let me start here. There's so many things to say. Um, I am towards the end of my training in spiritual direction. So it's a certificate program. It's all online and it involves an apprenticeship model. So I'm doing a lot of practicum spiritual direction with people and then bringing that to verbatims and um, videos and that sort of thing
Can you
to
pause
my,
for a second and talk a little bit about what spiritual direction is? It's not
yeah.
something that necessarily is talked about a lot in Methodist circles, even though it exists. I don't
Yeah.
think most people know what it is, really.
Okay. So I'm not sure that I know yet what it is. Like the truth of it is, um, I do think that it is the act of spiritual direction is much more of a contemplative listening model that allows the person that you're engaging with to encounter the spirit in his or her or their own terms and language and like heart work, right? So it's and this is the line that I was going to share, which I feel very much applies to my own life. I think it's can't remember who says it, but everything is gestation and birthing, right? So everything that happens in our lives, we're either in a gestational phase or we're in a birthing phase. Or maybe the labor in between, the hard, the pain. Um, so I still feel like I'm in a gestational phase when it comes to spiritual direction. Essentially, though, it is it is the art of bringing a loving presence to somebody, and that person and you are mutually aware that God is in the room with you. Silence is oftentimes a great way to engage that still small voice. It's like that passage that says, um, I think it was Elijah or was it Elisha that was listening for the voice of God, and it wasn't in the whirlwind and it wasn't it wasn't in
The
anything
thunder.
loud, the earthquake or the thunder. Um, it was in the whisper, the quiet, the gentle. And so I think that's a good image for what spiritual direction is, because in general, life is loud and busy and fast. And spiritual direction attempts to slow us down
Yeah.
and to say what's at the heart of the matter. And
Yeah.
oftentimes we actually know, we just haven't taken the time to sit still long
Yeah.
enough to listen. So it operates under the premise, at least for me, that spirit dwells within all of us. And if we take the time and develop the right kind of practices so that we're open to what the Spirit said. There is always something that will surprise us. So that's one of the little images for me that I love, is being willing to be surprised by the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I love everything you just said. And that would be my experience of spiritual direction, is for me some level of insight and
Mhm.
discernment into what is going on either in me right now, or why, I'm feeling a certain kind of way, to be able to give time and space to be attentive to
Mhm.
what God is doing in me, or just again, safe place to
Yeah,
um
to be vulnerable.
yeah. So it has pieces of like pastoral care. It has some pieces that are similar to counseling, but it's neither one of those things, and yet
Yep.
somehow both of those things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the other pieces that, as you were naming it, felt true to me, and that is the discernment piece.
Mhm.
Because a lot of a lot of spiritual direction is really this whole, like, if it's true that life is just gestation and birthing, right? Then our job is to be in a position of discernment. Like,
Mhm.
where am I at in this phase, and where I'm at, like, what's coming next, and what might I be missing in the midst of the busy that I could actually attune to more readily.
Or
Hmm.
what is being birthed?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how often do we're like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know where this is going, and to really, take a few steps back, or to, especially for so many of us who are caught in the cycle of busy, caught in the cycle of
Hmm.
stressors or anxiety, or um,
Mm-hmm.
to to get out of that and into that's really interesting. Got my hands okay.
I
Um,
know.
I got distracted there. Um, and again to look underneath, and to ask the question of uh, how is God at work? Uh,
Hmm. I think one helpful piece that might be, so folks, especially for folks who are lay, who may not necessarily know, like, hey, could spiritual direction be for me? I think it's also important to recognize that spiritual direction, at least in my opinion, right? Spiritual direction is about all things in life, right? So finding God in all things.
mhm.
It's not about being extra holy, or it's not about being somehow like so insightful or so spiritually grounded that you're like, I don't know, like set apart or something. It's like a very ordinary business, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, for example, like discernment, the number one piece, or like the place where you would start with discernment, is gathering all the facts.
Mhm.
Pros and cons list, for example, that could be a great piece of spiritual discernment for you. And I think we sometimes say, like, oh, head is separate from spirit, and that's not true. But sometimes we only live in our head, and we forget to do that balancing act with our spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. So in Yankton, I mean, we are blessed that we have the sisters here and offer spiritual
Yes,
direction, and so that is a local option. If this
that's
conversation
awesome.
is sparking something in you, that would be a great local option.
Hmm. Hmm.
I highly recommend them. Um, and if Emily ever finishes her degree, we can.
I'm just gonna keep reading books, guys, indefinitely, and then, like, I don't know. Ah. Yeah,
So
I'm actually.
sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say one thing that's coming up for me very recently, and I don't think that I've mentioned this to you, Katie, but on Monday I'm leading a group contemplative, I would say, like, kind of a workshop, but like we're just gonna do a contemplative practice for the South Dakota Synod of the ELCA in Pierre.
Nice.
And so, yeah, so I've got a couple hours workshop, and I say that in part because, number one, I love doing spiritual direction work in community, in groups. Yes, like one-on-one is and can be very profound because of the vulnerability and that sort of thing. But there's something almost magical that happens when you get a bunch of people who are similarly aware that Christ is in the seat next to you, who engage life just on a different wavelength, in part because they're in the presence of other people. who also identify like. And it's not unlike how you might feel in a worship space,
Mm.
but worship is oftentimes um, a little bit more like focused up front, like you're not as engaged necessarily in a contemplative way as you might be in sort of one of these intentional circles. So it's a cool opportunity to think about like outside the box of what it could be to be in a spiritual community.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We probably should.
I was like, it's already 2 o'clock.
I know. Uh, so I'm trying to think if there's anything that I need to share. For I think there's another women's night out coming up. So if you are not on the trying to remember what the name of the app is. Hold on. Group Me. You're not
Mm.
on the Group Me app for that. Let me know so we can get you on that so you can get the information and get signed up for those things. Disciple continues. We are moving upstairs to the confirmation room for Disciple this week instead of down in Wesley Hall, just for hearing acoustics. Acoustically, it's a better space. And so head up the stairs on Sunday morning. It'll literally be the only room with a light on at 8 o'clock in the morning. No one else is there. So I believe Jane is bringing donuts. I will still make coffee, but and we're continuing on in our series on crazy faith, so you're going to want to hear that. And yeah, otherwise we're just cruising along. Fall is here, and it's we have been busy. I visited with Tiffany on youth group, and we have about 23 students who are attending youth group regularly, which is amazing. I'm so excited. We have about 8 or 9 students in confirmation this year, and so things are just really moving and shaking, and it's very exciting. But Emily, I just want to say a big thank you for joining me today, and hopefully they find some interest in our kind of life story, and also in this new direction that your ministry is headed with spiritual direction.
Well, thank you, Katie, for the invite. And also, let me just sign off by saying to your church folk that I think they have a pretty amazing pastor. And I'm not biased at all. It's just true.
I appreciate that. Thank you so
It's
much.
just true. Yeah.
All right. Well, until next time, God bless. Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Going On, a video and audio podcast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. We'd love to have you join us for worship on Sundays at 10 a.m., either in person or via our live stream, which can be found at our website, www.firstumcyankton.org, or by searching First UMC Yankton on YouTube.